7 पक्ष हैं, 7 लोगों की उसमें भागीदारी मानी गई है। ये स्टेक होल्डर्स माने गए हैं विकलांग व्यक्तियों के समाज आधारित पुनर्वास। कौन है? विकलांग व्यक्ति स्वयं, विकलांग व्यक्तियों का परिवार। तीसरा है स्थानिक समाज, वो जिस गांव में, जिस बस्ती में, जिस वार्ड में रहते होंगे वो स्थानिक, मतलब जैसा नगर पालिका है, नगर निगम है, राज्य सरकार है और केंद्र सरकार है, इनकी अपनी भागीदारी है। उसमें गैर सरकारी संस्था है जैसा HRL जो है वो भी एक, उसकी भी अपनी एक भागीदारी है। विधि, आरोग्य, शिक्षण, ये न्याय से संबंधित लोग और बाकी जितने भी विशेषज्ञ लोग हैं उनकी अपनी भागीदारी है। और व्यापार उद्योग के जो लोग हैं उनकी भी अपनी भागीदारी है। ये सब यदि मिलकर एक साथ आगे बढ़ते हैं तो समाज आधारित पुनर्वास हो सकेगा विकलांग व्यक्तियों का, ऐसा मानना है। इसमें हम लोग बात करेंगे थोड़ा ज़्यादा ये जो सरकार की जो भागीदारी है उसके बारे में। और जैसा कि मुझे बताया कि आप में से बहुत लोग विधि से संबंधित हैं, वकील के छात्र हैं या फिर वकील हैं, तो उनके बारे में थोड़ा सा बात करेंगे। जब भी हम सरकार की बात करेंगे और मानवाधिकार या ऐसी चीजें बात करेंगे तो हमें परंपराओं में पहले जाना होता है, क्योंकि अधिकार हमारे परंपराओं से आते हैं। और फिर परंपराओं में से आने के बाद जब उनको एक जगह पर इकट्ठा कर लिया जाता है और फिर मान्यता दी जाती है कि ये हम मानते हैं, तो हमारा अपना संविधान बनता है। इसी तरह का जो भारत का संविधान है उसमें आर्टिकल 14, 15, 16 और 21 ये विकलांग व्यक्तियों के मानवाधिकार को प्रोत्साहित करते हैं। किस तरह से करते हैं उसके बारे में राजू जी थोड़ा सा ज्यादा विस्तार से बताएंगे आपको। लेकिन मैं बता दूं कि भले वो आर्टिकल 14 कह रहा होगा कि कायदा पूरे समान था, कानून के आगे सारे एक है, लेकिन उसको डिफाइन करते हुए, उसको इंटरप्रेट करते हुए हमारे सारे जजेस और सारे लोग कहते हैं कि नहीं, कुछ लोग विशेष समान होते हैं, तो उनके लिए ज़्यादा विशेष समान अवसर प्राप्त करने के लिए करके यह आर्टिकल बीच में नहीं आएगा। तो विकलांग व्यक्तियों के लिए कुछ विशेष समान अवसर प्रदान किए गए इसमें। इस तरह से राजू की बात करेंगे उसके बारे में। और स्टेट के लिए जो गाइडलाइन प्रिंसिपल्स दिए हुए हैं उसमें एक सबसे महत्व का आर्टिकल 41, जिसमें कि संविधान में पहली बार विशेष तौर पर विकलांगता का संबंध आया है। इसके अलावा आर्टिकल 39 जो आजीविका के संबंध में अवसर प्रदान करने की बात कर रहा है, आर्टिकल 39A है। उसके बाद में 46 और 47 जो शिक्षण और आरोग्य के बारे में बात कर रहा है, तो उसमें भी गाइडलाइन प्रिंसिपल्स में आया। इसके आधार पर बाकी कानून बने। इसमें विकलांगता, केवल विकलांगता से संबंधित 4 कानून है जिनके बारे में थोड़ा राजू भी बताएंगे। लेकिन मैं थोड़ा 5वें कानून के बारे में आपका ध्यान आकर्षित करूंगा। वो है NREG, नेशनल रूरल एम्प्लॉयमेंट गारंटी एक्ट। इसमें साफ तौर पर, इससे पहले कभी नहीं आया था, लेकिन एम्प्लॉयमेंट गारंटी देते हुए उन्होंने साफ तौर पर कहा विकलांग व्यक्तियों को उनकी समर्थता के अनुपात से काम दिया जाएगा। ये इससे पहले कभी बात नहीं की थी साफ तौर पर। हम लोग उसके बारे में थोड़ा और चर्चा करेंगे कैसा है। 1995 में जो कानून बना विकलांग व्यक्तियों के उनको समान अवसर प्रदान करने का, उनकी सामाजिक समावेशिता बढ़ाने के लिए, तो खास विकलांग व्यक्तियों के लिए जो कानून बोलकर 1995 का है, तो उसके आधार पर महाराष्ट्र सरकार को 2001 में उनकी नींद खुली और वो भी बहुत लोगों ने नींद से उठाया, उनको झंझोड़ा। इसलिए फिर उन्होंने एक वर्क प्लान बनाया और वो वर्क प्लान इस तौर पर रहा। तो बात बहुत अच्छी की उन्होंने। वो प्रतिष्ठा आणि सम्मान अनोखा समर्थ व्यक्तींसाठी त्यांचे समर्थक कौशल्यावर बहुत अच्छी बात रखी है। और उसको रखने के लिए उन्होंने कहा कि हम प्रभावी संकल्पना देंगे। कैसे? तो विकलांगता का प्रतिबंधन, सबसे पहले तो विकलांगता नहीं होना चाहिए, और जो विकलांग व्यक्ति है उनके लिए हम लोग आरोग्य की सुविधा उपलब्ध कराते हैं। उसके बारे में महाराष्ट्र सरकार ने बात रखी है। उसके बाद में वो सर्व शिक्षा अभियान का भी आपने नाम सुना है, तो वैसी योजनाओं की बात रखी है जिसमें कि हर विकलांग बच्चे को पढ़ने का अवसर मिलेगा। रोजगार और स्वयं रोजगार के लिए अलग अलग योजनाओं की बात की, और रोजगार के संदर्भ में उन्होंने हर जगह पर कहा कि हर जगह पर 3% का आरक्षण होगा विकलांग व्यक्ति के लिए, लेकिन स्थानीय या राज्य सरकार या केंद्र सरकार के क्षेत्र में 5% का होगा, ऐसा उन्होंने। ऐसी नौकरियों के संदर्भ में हम नौकरियों के अवसर भी बढ़ाएंगे, ऐसा भी कहा। अभी यहाँ तो उतना समझ में नहीं आ रहा है कि ग्राउंड फ्लोर पर है, लेकिन हर जगह पर हर बिल्डिंग में यही दिक्कत आती है कि विकलांग व्यक्ति पहुंचेंगे कैसे, रैंप की सुविधा नहीं होगी। तो उस बारे में उन्होंने बात की कि महाराष्ट्र राज्य में हम जो भी करेंगे, जो भी बिल्डिंग बनाएंगे, उसमें गाइडलाइंस में रखेंगे कि विकलांग व्यक्ति बहुत आसानी से पहुंच सके। इसके अलावा विकलांग व्यक्तियों के संबंध में जितनी भी जानकारी है उसको हम ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा प्रकाशित करेंगे, ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा उसको एडवर्टाइजमेंट करेंगे वगैरह उन्होंने बात की। इसके अलावा विधि विषय के बारे में मतलब उन्होंने कहा कि हम लोग हर चीज़ में विकलांग व्यक्तियों का ध्यान में रखेंगे, ऐसा सारी योजनाओं में, सारे जो कानून है उसमें हर एक चीज ध्यान रखेंगे। कहा प्रभावी अमलबजावनी यंत्रणा, अमल के लिए प्रभावी यंत्रणा मतलब उनका केवल इतना है कि एक समिति गठित करेंगे और वो समिति के अध्यक्ष समाज कल्याण मंत्री होंगे। सरकार के लिए तो सबसे आसान पक्ष यही है, प्रभावी अमल के लिए एक समिति होती है उनके पास में, और उसके अध्यक्ष वो मंत्री होते हैं, और उसके सचिव जो होते हैं वो कैबिनेट, उनके मंत्रालय के जो सचिव वो सचिव हो जाते हैं। और वित्तीय व्यवस्था के लिए महाराष्ट्र सरकार ने कहा कि हम केंद्र सरकार से पैसा मांगेंगे, हम अपना पैसा नहीं देंगे, कहने का मतलब ऐसा हो गया। तो बड़े अच्छी अच्छी बातें करने वाला सरकार, जैसा मैं कह रहा था कि विकलांग व्यक्तियों को पुनर्वास में सरकार की भागीदारी बहुत महत्वपूर्ण, तो इस तरह से दिखाई देती है। महाराष्ट्र में 2001 की जनगणना के आधार पर कुछ आंकड़े रखे हैं, प्रस्तुत है। 65% अभी ये थोड़ा परसेंटेज घटा है ग्रामीण विकलांग, क्योंकि महाराष्ट्र में ऐसा हो गया कि जनवरी 2008 में हमारी 50% जनता शहरी हो गई, तो विकलांग व्यक्ति भी अब ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा शहरी हो गए। लेकिन मैं बता दूं कि ये जो जितने भी आंकड़े दिए हैं इसमें बहुत ज़्यादा तथ्य नहीं है। इसकी वजह एक 2001 की जनगणना में पहली बार विकलांग व्यक्तियों का सर्वेक्षण किया गया, तो जितने भी सर्वेक्षण करने वाले जितने भी कर्मचारी थे वो कुछ अच्छे प्रशिक्षित नहीं थे, बहुत विकलांग व्यक्ति से मिस थे। और दूसरी बात, विशेषतः मानसिक विकलांग व्यक्ति उसमें हर बार मिस थे। और दूसरी बात, हमारा अपना अनुभव जो रहा उसके आधार पर बताओ, हम लोग सन 2000 से इस क्षेत्र में काम करना शुरू किया, और देखिए कि हम लोगों ने 2001 में पहले एक लिस्ट बनाई, 22 गाँव में सर्वे करके, तब हमें केवल 40 विकलांग व्यक्ति मिले 22 गाँव में हमारे। और जब 2000 फिर हमने ट्रेनिंग लिया, हमारी अपनी समझ ज़्यादा बढ़ी, और उसके बाद में जब सर्वे किया तो वही 22 गाँव में वो 40 विकलांग व्यक्तियों के 121 हो गए। आज तब तक ये ध्यान गाँव के लोग भी नहीं बता रहे थे, और हमारी अपनी भी नज़र नहीं बनी थी। लेकिन उसके बाद में जब नज़र बनी तो ध्यान में आने लगा कि विकलांग व्यक्ति बहुत ज़्यादा पैमाने पर। हाँ, हालांकि कुछ 1.5% होता है हमारे जो लोक संख्या उसका। महाराष्ट्र में माना गया है कि कुछ 1.62% ही है। हम लोगों ने काम इस तरह से ट्रेनिंग लेकर काम करना शुरू किया, तो मैं बता रहा हूँ ये जो नजर बन रहा है कि विकलांग व्यक्ति है, विकलांग होते हुए भी दिखाई नहीं पड़ना, ये हमारे साथ में जिस तरह से हुआ, तो इसलिए हम मानते हैं कि 2001 की जनगणना में कोई ज़्यादा तथ्य नहीं। वहां तो बहुत ज्यादा हुआ होगा। अब उससे संबंधित आपने बता दिया, विकलांग व्यक्तियों के लिए सबसे बड़ी दिक्कत पुनर्वास का काम हो चाहे कोई भी काम हो, तो उनके पास में वो विकलांग है इसका सर्टिफिकेट। जब हमने 121 विकलांग व्यक्तियों से बात की थी बालस गांव के, तो केवल 8 लोगों के पास में सर्टिफिकेट, और फिर जब 103 गांव में पहुंचे हम लोग, जिसमें 591 विकलांग व्यक्ति की लिस्ट बनी, तो उसमें भी कोई 69 लोगों के पास में सर्टिफिकेट। और फिर एक लंबा दौर चला सरकार को मनवाने का और जिला प्रशासन के साथ बातचीत का, उन पर दबाव डालने का, और उसका है कि तहसील लेवल पर विकलांगता सर्टिफिकेट मिलना शुरू है। उनको उन्होंने कैंप अरेंज करना शुरू किया। आज तो आज की स्थिति में 502 लोगों के पास, 591 में से 502 लोगों के पास में बने हैं। क्योंकि देखिए कि बहुत गरीब और पिछड़ा हुआ इलाका और आदिवासी इलाका, जहाँ पर जिला के स्तर पर जाने के लिए भी लोगों के पास में पैसे नहीं। मैं जो कह रहा था यदि कि गरीबी विकलांगता बढ़ाती है और विकलांगता गरीबी बढ़ाती है, तो उसमें और समाज कल्याण विभाग जिला का गढ़चिरौली जिले का, जो कि सबसे मुख्य विभाग है विकलांग लोगों के लिए सुविधा देने का, वो दूसरे मंजिल पर। सोचिए कि कैसे पहुंच सकते थे विकलांग व्यक्ति। उन्हें अल्टीमेटम दिया गया कि 15 अगस्त से यदि आपका कार्यालय नीचे नहीं आया तो हम लोग वहां कुपोषण के लिए बैठ रहे हैं। तब के वो उस धमकी से डर कर नीचे उतर कर, सरकार ऐसे ऊपर ही चढ़ी रहती है हमेशा। देखिए कायदे कानून में तो सब लिखा हुआ है, लेकिन जब तक कि इस तरह का दबाव नहीं बनता, इस तरह से सारा समाज एक साथ इकट्ठा होकर दबाव नहीं बनाएगा, तो कायदे कानून अपने धरे की धरे रह जाते हैं। बाकी जगह पर देखिए 2 ग्राम पंचायतों में बहुत ही झगड़ा करके लोगों ने पूरे ग्राम सभा में झगड़ा किया, और तब नहीं जाकर 3% का बजट उनके लिए आरक्षित हुआ विकलांग। लेकिन ये ग्राम सभा ने झगड़ा किया, मतलब ग्राम सभा में अपने सारे लोग इकट्ठा होकर झगड़ा किए। लोगों ने बोला कि नहीं कानून है, हम बताते हैं कहाँ लिखा है, कैसा लिखा है, तब कुछ नहीं हुआ। और न्याय विषय में तो सबसे मुश्किल, सबसे दिक्कत था, केवल कानून में लिखा है विकलांग व्यक्तियों को भी काम मिले, लेकिन जब वो उन्होंने विकलांग संगठन का आधार बनाया, मतलब विकलांग अपने तहसील के क्षेत्र का विकलांग संगठन जो है, वो लोग जाकर भिड़े और कहा कि हम लोग तो तहसील ऑफिस के सामने उपोषण करने वाले हैं, ऐसा करने वाले, वैसा करने वाले हो गए, बहुत झगड़ा किए। तब जाकर एक व्यक्ति को काम मिला, और वो एक व्यक्ति के बलबूते पर पुराने 21 लोगों ने काम किया। लेकिन 15 ही दिन का, 100 दिन का भी नहीं। महाराष्ट्र में तो 365 दिन का काम मिलने होना, तो 100 दिन का छोड़िए 15 दिन में काम मिलता है। अभी भी लड़ाई जारी है। और अंततः मैं जो कहना चाहता था वो ये है, हाँ फूल है, कांटे भी हैं, लेकिन कांटे में बहुत सुंदर सुंदर फूल खिलते हैं। जैसा कि आप कैक्टस का फूल देख रहे हैं, गुलाब का फूल है, और पीछे से कमल भी खिलते हैं। हमें समाज को और भी ज्यादा सामाजिक बनाना है। आप सबको नहीं शुभेच्छा है।
Thank you, Dr. Rajiv Varis, for your nice session. I would now like to invite Mr. Rajiv. Do you want to put the...
Giving us a brief on community-based rehabilitation, जिसको हिंदी में सामूहिक पुनर्वास कहते हैं। क्या मैं अंग्रेजी में बोल सकता हूँ या हिंदी में बोलूँ? Thank you. My name is Rajiv. I work for Human Rights Law Network in the Disability Rights Initiative. As part of our work in Disability Rights Initiative, we network with organizations working for disabled people. We network with disabled persons. We undertake capacity building training programs. We come out with a lot of publications on know your rights. Some of our publications are also in accessible formats, like we come out with information in braille for blind people. We come out with information on sign interpretation in CDs for deaf people. We also take up issues of violation of rights of persons with disabilities in various forums across the country through our 26 offices and our lawyers based in our offices. We take up litigation at the state level with the State Disability Commissioner in the state high courts. We also take up litigation with the Chief Commissioner of Disabilities in Delhi and also in the Supreme Court, apart from various forums like the administrative tribunals, the human rights commissions in the states and in Delhi. I will be speaking to you on the provisions under various disability acts. I will be speaking in a little, not in detail, I will be briefly touching upon the UN Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which India has recently signed, and it has become an international law. And I will also be touching upon what happens now that we have signed the UN Convention. Just to give you a background on the situation of persons with disabilities in India, whilst the government estimates are around 2 to 3%, like Dr. Rahul had said, that the census of 2001 had enumerated persons with disabilities, but on its own admission, the government has admitted that the enumerators were not trained, coupled with the fact that in India, there is a tendency amongst families to hide persons with disabilities, particularly those who have a mental illness, so they never figured in the count. Estimates of the NGO sector put persons with disabilities around 60 to 70 million, which is roughly 6 to 7% of our population. And if we look at this huge number of 60 to 70 million disabled people, and if we compare it to populations in European countries, we will find that there are so many European countries whose total population is far less than the number of disabled in India. So, disability in India is a major issue. There are a lot of enactment statutes which have been enacted in India for protecting rights of persons with disabilities, and I'll speak to you about them now. If you look at our Constitution, Articles 14, equality of the law and equal protection of the law, Article 15, which is prohibition of discrimination, Article 16, reservation in public employment, and Article 21, right to life. Now these provisions apply equally to persons with disabilities as to any other person. If you look at the Indian legislations which are concerning persons with disabilities, there are 4 laws which have been enacted in this country. We have the Mental Health Act of 1987, we have the Rehabilitation Council of India Act of 1992, we have the Persons with Disabilities Act of 1995, and then we have the National Trust Act of 1999. Now these 4 acts, I would say it's only the Persons with Disabilities Act which gives certain rights to persons with disabilities. If we look at the Mental Health Act of 1987, this is an act which has been enacted for the care, treatment and protection of persons with mental illness. There was a very old act in India, the Indian Lunacy Act of 1912, and as understanding grew in the country that with the use of psychotropic drugs, psychosocial disabilities, mental illness could be controlled to some extent. So this act was enacted and the 1912 Indian Lunacy Act was repealed. Largely this act contains almost what was there in the Indian Lunacy Act of 1912 except for the treatment part of it. If we look at the objectives next. If we look at the objectives of the Mental Health Act, what are the objectives of the Mental Health Act? Regulation of admission to institutions, to protect society from mentally ill people who are considered a danger, to provide free legal aid at state expense, the issue of guardianship, the setting up of central and state medical authorities for mental health services, and regulations for certification of institutions. Now these are the objectives of the Act, And if you really look at the Mental Health Act of 1987, it is a very regressive act, because instead of giving rights to the person who is mentally ill, his rights are taken away. And what are his rights? Next. What are the rights of the mentally ill person? The only rights which will be given to him under this act are that he will not be treated with indignity and cruelty, that he will not be subject to experimental treatment, and that his correspondence will not be intercepted, will not be detained, or will not be destroyed. So this act is not really giving anything to the person who has a psychosocial disability or mental illness. On the contrary, if rights are given to anybody under this act, they have been given to the doctors, to the police, to the magistrates, to the institutions. So actually a very regressive act. The next act is the Rehabilitation Council of India Act 1992. This is an act which is there for regulating the training of rehabilitation professionals and the maintenance of a central register. Now what exactly does this act do? What used to be happening in this country was that a lot of unqualified people used to be working in the field of rehabilitation of persons with disabilities. You would find in the villages quacks would the miracle men would try to cure persons with disabilities even though there was no cure. And you found that institutions were mushrooming all over the country ostensibly to rehabilitate persons with disabilities, but these were all untrained professionals. So this act was primarily brought across for the reason that whoever works in the field of rehabilitation of persons with disabilities has to be certified under the RCI Act. There is a central register which is maintained with the RCI, and once you are certified, you can be entered in that register, and once you are entered in that register, you can practice rehabilitation in any part of the country. And rehabilitation could be in terms of special educators, in terms of audiologists, it could be in terms of prosthetic engineers, it could also be in terms of psychiatrists and psychologists. In little detail about this act, I will also share with you areas where our organization has been litigating, the issues on which litigation is happening. And if there are lawyers present here in this group, I will also ask them to look into these areas where they could possibly litigate when it comes to persons with disabilities. Now this is an act which is a social welfare legislation, and which is basically talking about the integration of persons with disabilities and providing them opportunities for their full participation. If I can put some numbers to this act, then this act would roughly, 10% of this act would be roughly talking about rights, and the balance 90% of this act is talking about duties and responsibilities of the government. So under this act, the government has a huge responsibility to provide integration and equal opportunities to persons with disabilities. There are 7 kinds of disability conditions which have been recognized under this act: blindness, low vision, leprosy cured, mental illness, mental retardation, orthopedic disabilities. Next. Who is entitled to rights under this PWD Act? Any person who has a certification of 40% or more disability is entitled to rights under the Act. The general benefits are available to all persons with disabilities irrespective of their percentage of disability. Now if you look at the disability certification in India, also certification has to be done by duly constituted medical authorities. Any private practitioner cannot give a disability certificate. Only a certificate which has been issued by an authorized body can be recognized under this Act. If you look at the definition of disability in the UN Convention, which has recently become an international law, it's quite different from what the definition of disability under the Indian laws are. If you look at the Indian laws, it's a very medical kind of definition that they have. You have to be blind, or you need to be leprosy cured, or you need to be hearing impaired to be called disabled. But the UN Convention has a very inclusive definition of disability, and it states that disability includes those with long-term mental, sensory, physical, or intellectual impairments which in their interaction with barriers prohibited their participation. So this is actually a very, very social construct kind of a definition which has happened now with the UN Convention. And obviously, since we have signed and ratified the UN Convention, there will be some changes happening as far as definition of disability in India is concerned. We need to see how well we would be able to get a social definition of our disability. Next slide. If you look at the provisions under this Act, there are provisions of the Constitution of Central and State Coordination and Executive Committees. There is prevention and early detection of disabilities. There is employment, there is education, there is affirmative action, non-discrimination, then there is grievance redressal, social security, then there are provisions for institutions for severe disabilities and institutions for disabled people. So these are the broad provisions under this Persons with Disabilities Act. Now the Central and State Coordination Committees and the Central and State Executive Committees are basically very high-powered committees which have been formed in the center and in the states, which comprise of the ministers, secretaries, disability commissioner, and various secretaries and joint secretaries of various ministries of the government in the state and the government of India. And these high-powered coordination committees are basically supposed to formulate policies for disabled persons, whether it is education, whether it is related to schemes, whether it is related to international financing, international partnership with organizations. And the state and the central executive committee are basically policy implementation bodies, so they are supposed to be implementing whatever has been decided by the coordination committee. Unfortunately, in India, what is happening and what we have seen out of experience is that the state coordination committees and the central coordination committees, which are supposed to meet once in 6 months, hardly ever meet. And what is even more surprising is that the minutes of the meeting of the coordination committees are not circulated to the executive committees. So we have a situation where executive committees, which are supposed to be implementing policy, do not know what the policy has been formulated by the coordination committees. Now this is hugely an area of concern, and wherever we go into, whichever states we go into, we do tell the organizations that under the RTI you should ask for information on minutes of proceedings of these meetings. Next. Prevention and early detection. Under this chapter, the government is supposed to do a lot of things. Some of it is happening, some of it is not happening. The government is mandated to survey, investigate and research on the reasons why disability happens. They're supposed to promote methods for preventing disability. They're supposed to screen all children once in a year to see whether there is any form of disability or not. Then there is training of the primary health workers, awareness creation and information dissemination on health, hygiene and sanitation. There is this provision for prenatal, postnatal and perinatal checkup of mother and child. Now this act is a very, very gender neutral act. It does not talk about women and children specifically. Children to an extent are covered under the chapter on education, but women are not addressed in this act, and so women with disabilities do not have any special entitlements, except in this little provision in the chapter of prevention and early detection, where there is talk about prenatal, postnatal, perinatal care of mother and child, basically to ensure that a pregnant woman gets the right kind of nutrition, and the environment is such that she does not deliver a baby with a disability purely out of malnutrition. Apart from this, under this chapter, the government is also supposed to be creating awareness campaigns through mass media, radio, television, and a whole lot of things. Now, if you look at this particular chapter, in India, I would say that the polio campaign has been a very, very successful campaign as far as prevention and detection of disability is concerned. That's one of the very, very positive campaigns that the government has undertaken. But beyond that, there is nothing else which is happening. I doubt if children are being screened once a year. And there have been so many instances which have been coming to us on fluorosis. This is a disability which is caused by contamination of drinking water. And if one has fluoride contaminated drinking water, then it develops into orthopedic disabilities. Your bones become very brittle, you do not grow in height, and generally you develop some sort of a disability. Now we have been getting these reports from various states because of fluorosis and disability happening. Last year we happened to be in Rajasthan, and we had one such meeting of organizations working on disabilities. And there was an organization which had come from Barmer district, and there they told us about this incident. And after that, our team from our Jaipur unit went and they investigated, and they found that yes, fluorosis was happening. They documented, and we were able to take up this petition in the Rajasthan High Court. Similarly, such instances were reported to us in Uttar Pradesh, and we took up a public interest litigation in the High Court in Allahabad. And we were able to get, through the intervention of the courts, relief to these persons, where the court was asked to direct the chief medical officer to go and camp in these villages, issue disability certificates, and the government was also asked to ensure drinking water provision. So things are happening, but things are happening only when courts are their intervention is sought. And just last month we were in Orissa, we had a similar meeting there with disability organizations, and the same problem has come up, and I am told that in Orissa this is happening in almost 14 to 15 districts of that state. Now it's a very small state, there will be about roughly 30 districts there. And 14 to 15 districts are reporting this fluorosis. There is an organization which has conducted a study on this, and we are also examining options of taking this issue to the Orissa High Court. Under the RTI, we have filed for some information. So this is an area which is of concern, where the government is mandated to provide certain things, and they have a huge responsibility. But all this is hidden under a small proviso which says that subject to economic capacity. So if the state says that we don't have the money, they can go away scot-free. Next. This education is a very, very empowering chapter in the Persons with Disabilities Act. And under this chapter, provided to children with disabilities till the age of 18 years in an appropriate environment. The catchword here is appropriate environment. What is an appropriate environment? That needs to be defined. Our Constitution gives free education till the age of 16 years, but this Act makes it till 18 years. It's appropriate education, education in an appropriate environment, integration in normal schools, and special schools for those who need special schools. The Act says that special schools be provided in such a way that a child in need of a special school in any part of the country will be able to access such schools which have come up with public and private partnerships. Now, if one literally takes that little clause into account, then a special school should be there in every 5 kilometers of the country. But there is a dearth of special schools, especially schools for those who are severely disabled. And because the government was not able to provide this special school for all children who need special education, so they have come up with inclusive education in the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, where children with disabilities are supposed to be part of the students who will be taking part in this campaign. And there are special educators who have been provided in the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan to undertake teaching of these children with special needs. As we go across the country, we get a lot of reports about one special educator in one block, and one block will have 15 to 20 schools. So one really wonders what kind of education these children with disabilities are able to get under this campaign, under this Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan. Then it also talks about non-formal education, like children who have only certain class 5 special part-time classes will be given to them. Children who till the age of 16 have not received any education, they will be imparted vocational training. And for all this non-formal education, the Anganwadi workers, the PHC workers will be trained so that they can impart non-formal education. Then there are schemes for providing aids and appliances to children, the setting up of training institutions for trained manpower, because only trained teachers will be able to teach children with special needs. Then there are schemes for providing on education which talk about transport subsidy to children with disabilities. It talks about free uniforms, free books in braille for blind children, the removal of mathematics for blind children, only one language for children who are deaf, legal redressal forums for their parents. So the provisions are very good, but unfortunately what is happening in our country is that children with disabilities are being deprived of education. One of the hugest barriers they face is that schools are not accessible. They are unable to reach the first floor, the second floor, the toilets are inaccessible. And because these children are expected to relieve themselves out in the open, out of sheer embarrassment, they are not going to schools. This is an area of huge concern. There is one very empowering provision in this chapter under which a lot of litigation is happening and can happen, because this is an area which lawyers should look into. This is that any government institution or any institution being provided aid by the government is to reserve 3% seats for children with disabilities. Now what is happening is that a lot of institutions in the country, private institutions in the country, have been provided land by the government at concessional rates. And just by virtue of the fact that there is some sort of a support being extended to them by the government, they come under this clause. So you can look at taking schools to court if they are not providing education or not providing this 3% reservation to children with disabilities, provided of course there is some sort of an assistance from the government. It could be in terms of concessional land, it could be in terms of duty drawbacks, etc., etc. This provision was actually under the employment chapter of the Persons with Disabilities Act, but judicial pronouncements have been so proactive on this issue. This particular provision is now being treated as part of education, and it has been interpreted to be that there is a 3% reservation in educational institutions for persons with disabilities. Employment. Now this is another empowering provision. The government is supposed to identify jobs where disabled people can work. A list is supposed to be maintained, and this list is supposed to be reviewed every 3 years, keeping technological advancements in mind. Now, see, I'm a blind person and I cannot read, but I can work on the computer with the help of a special software. So this is an instance of technology advancement happening where persons with disabilities can take advantage of. And this is supposed to be reflected in the list, the identified list. This is not happening actually. If you look at the identified list, you will still find that the job of a cane weaver has been reserved for a blind person. See, in the olden, say 20 years back, 30 years back, there used to be a lot of cane chairs in the government departments, government offices, which needed to be recaned every 3-4 years. So this job was identified for blind people. But today, if you go to any government offices, you hardly come across any cane chairs. You find all cushion chairs. But this job is still being kept as an identified job for persons with disabilities. Whereas a computer operator's job is not identified for a person with blindness, because they have not taken into consideration the technological advancements. Also, this identification of jobs only happened about 6 years after the Act was passed, and that too through the intervention of the court. The court directed the government to identify the jobs. Now, in these identified jobs, there is a 3% reservation, 1% for the blind, 1% for the hearing impaired, and 1% for the locomotor impaired. There are provisions that if there is an advertisement which is stating specifically that vacancy is reserved for disabled people, and if a suitable blind candidate is not found in the first year of recruitment, then that post has to be kept vacant for the second year. And if in the second year also they don't find a suitable blind person, then it has to be interchanged between the disability groups. And only in the third year can this be opened up to the general public. There is provision for special employment exchanges. Special employment exchanges are supposed to register educated disabled people. They are supposed to network with public sector organizations, find out vacancies. And they are also authorized to go and check records of government offices to see how many disabled people have been employed. There are certain schemes that the government is supposed to enact for employment of persons with disabilities, and these schemes are supposed to include issues like relaxation of upper age limit. For instance, if the upper age limit is 30 for a particular job, for a disabled person will be 35 or 36, because it is assumed that persons with disabilities cannot access education like the way other people do. So there is a relaxation in upper age limit. There are provisions for training of disabled people whilst on job, a non-handicapping environment, an accessible work location, health and safety measures. Apart from that, there is the provision of 3% reservation in all poverty alleviation schemes. Now this is again very empowering because there are a lot of poverty alleviation schemes operating across the country. Dr. Rahul spoke about the Rural Employment Guarantee Act. This is a poverty alleviation scheme, and there is a 3% reservation for persons with disabilities here as well. Then you have schemes like the Rajiv Gandhi Rozgar Yojana and a lot of other poverty alleviation schemes, which has a 3% reservation for disabled people. Now the catchword here again is that here it has not been specified that this 3% reservation is only for blind, orthopedic and hearing impairment disabilities. So here there is a 3% reservation for all disabilities. Unlike in the earlier identification of jobs where it's been specifically stated for the three categories, here it is okay. Apart from this on employment, there is this huge private sector which has been left completely untapped. The public sector is gradually being privatized, jobs are reducing in the government, and the job opportunities are opening up in the private sector. We have a lot of IT industries happening. I am sure Nagpur also will be having a lot of call centers. So the new industries which are coming up, there is, the private sector has been completely left out from the purview of the Act, except for this little provision which says that any organization, private or public sector, if they employ 5% or more disabled persons, then there will be some special incentive schemes for them. Today in this country, we have incentive schemes for industry if they come up in backward areas, if they come up in travel-dominated areas, if they come up in export-oriented zones. But if there is an industrialist who wants to set up an industry and he says that I will employ 5% disabled people, there is no incentive scheme spelled out as yet by the government. This is an area for advocacy, and there are organizations which have been repeatedly working on this. I know of an organization which had some 5 zonal consultations, and a draft memorandum on the incentive proposal was submitted to the finance minister some 2 years back. Nothing happened. Only last year, Mr. Chidambaram, during his budget speech, said that any organization, private or public, if they have disabled persons working with them, and if the disabled person has been confirmed in his assignment, then for 3 years his ESI and PF contribution will be subsidized by the government. This is the only little clause that they have come up with. Also, the finance minister had made a statement 2 years back saying that the government is going to create some 1 lakh jobs for persons with disabilities, and each of these jobs will have a minimum salary of 25,000 rupees. That's really, really amazing, because today if you look at disabled persons, I don't think there are very many who are even earning 20,000 rupees per month. So whilst the statement has been very, very positive, I don't think it is translated as yet into action. There was some money which was kept aside for this as well, so one needs to find out from the RTI what exactly is happening here. So this was what I had to talk about employment. Now this is an area where a lot of litigation is happening, and this is an area which you could, as lawyers now or maybe when you pass out, look into, because whilst organizations are half-heartedly making attempts to provide employment, they are not meeting the 3% mandate, and we have this fantastic case of National Association of the Blind, that's a Bombay case, Maharashtra case, where the NAB took the government to task and said that please let us know what is this 3% limit that you have fixed so far. The Act was passed in 1995. And the Mumbai High Court ordered the Chief Secretary of Maharashtra to, within 6 months, provide this information. And this happened last year in 2005 or 2006. And after 6 months, the Chief Secretary went to the court and filed an affidavit stating that he needed more time because he did not have the information ready with him. To which the court ordered that, fine, you take another 6 months to find out, but in this 6 months we are freezing all your recruitments. So all government recruitment in Maharashtra came to a point some years back. And what happened in the process was that these special employment exchanges, they started getting an increase in notifications, and some employment exchanges almost registered a 400 to 500% increase in notifications. So when you shake the government, things do happen. And this was one very, very positive PI which happened in the Mumbai High Court. Apart from that, there are a lot of personal litigations that we have been taken for individual relief. We are contacted by government employees working in the government, in the public sectors, who are being denied their allowances, who are being denied promotions. So these are all issues that we have been taking up in the courts. And there was one very interesting PI which we are about to file in the Supreme Court, which I would like to share with you. These public sector undertakings, these mega Ratna companies or the mini Ratna companies, there are 66 of these companies, one of our partner organizations in Madhya Pradesh. They filed for some information under the RTI to find out how many disabled people had been employed since 1995. And the information we were able to gather from all these 66 mega PSUs, and we were shocked to find that the employment status was only 0.59% against the mandated 3%. We were also shocked to find out that not a single blind person has been employed in the last 11 years, and not a single hearing impaired person has been employed in the last 11 years, ever since the Act was passed. And we are almost ready with that public implementation. We are taking all these PSUs to court by next week, hopefully we will find that. So this is an area where things are happening. We find similar cases in Chandigarh. We were able to identify 200 jobs in the Chandigarh Union Territory Administration. In Arunachal Pradesh, we took up a litigation where there was no reservation in A, B categories of jobs, and there is a DOPT circular which states that there has to be reservation in A and B categories as well. And we were able to take this issue up in the Arunachal High Court, and the court has ordered for identification of jobs. So things are happening, but things are happening only when the courts are shaking or when the government is shaking. Willfully it's not happening. So this is an area which you should examine, because if you're able to provide some sort of a relief, it will make a lot of difference to the lives of people with disabilities. Affirmative action, under this chapter there is provision for free aids and appliances to persons with